I always reflect on the fact that had someone told me, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that this would be the trajectory of my life, it would have seemed quite surprising. But speaking about historical trajectories, or my own historical trajectory, let me make an observation about the extent to which historical perspective allows us to forge richer understandings of whatever we're trying to comprehend. In order to develop a deeper comprehension of what is often called the crisis of mass incarceration, we can't simply begin with current events. We can't simply start with the present. If you focus primarily on the present, you will acquire the mistaken impression that what is shaped purely by immediate circumstances, or what happened not very long ago, and that perhaps what happened in the past is securely locked away from the present. And so I want to begin with a quotation from an essay that was written in the 1980s by critical theorist Frederick Jameson, who wrote in an essay called Postmodernism and Consumer Society. He wrote about what he called the disappearance of a sense of history. And I'm quoting from his essay, "The way in which our entire contemporary social system has little by little begun to lose its capacity to retain its own past, has begun to live in a perpetual present that obliterates traditions of the kind which all earlier social formations have had in one way or another to preserve. Think only about the media exhaustion of news, of how Nixon, and even more so Kennedy, are figures from a now distant past." He was writing this in the 1980s, I should say. One is tempted to say that the very function of the news media is to relegate such recent historical experiences as rapidly as possible into the past. The informational function of the media would thus be to help us forget, to serve as the very agents and mechanisms for our historical amnesia. And so I would say that in order to grasp the complex connections between racism and over-incarceration, we have to acknowledge the deep historical roots of racism, of punishment, and their inextricable interactions. And this would mean, for example, that we cannot simply focus on the war on drugs as the driving force for mass incarceration. And this has been, of course, one of the explanations that has been preferred, especially recently. The war on drugs was certainly one of the factors, especially with respect to federal institutions, federal facilities, but even more important was the attack on the welfare state that helped to usher in the era of global capitalism. During the 1980s, and of course that is the period when the numbers of incarcerated people began to soar. During the 1980s, we witnessed the beginning of the breakdown of institutions that were designed to ensure human welfare, such as the healthcare system, housing, education. And at the same time, jobs began to migrate to areas of the world where labor was cheaper and the labor movement was less organized. It is not accidental that the numbers of union members have declined as the numbers of imprisoned people have risen. 50 years ago, 1/3 of all workers were unionized. Today, it is only 1 in 10. And of course, Black people and people of color were most seriously affected by this downspin in union membership, as we can see today by the racial composition of low-wage jobs, the racial composition of the unemployed, and the racial composition of low-wage jobs, and the current effort to achieve a $15 minimum wage. And that is, that's quite astounding, isn't it? That we can't even take for granted a living wage. Now, I mention these economic developments because one has to ask, what is it that has been responsible for people engaging in underground activity that might lead along a trajectory toward arrest and imprisonment? And I say parenthetically, we know, we followed the stop and frisk movement, and we know that people who are caught in that web of repression, police, prisons, have not necessarily engaged in, quote, illegal activity. But of course, people do engage in unlawful activity. A lot of people engage in unlawful activity. Many, many more people than are actually targeted. And I think it's important for us to recognize the role of surveillance. That is one of the factors related to structural racism that leads to higher numbers of people of color being caught up in the web of the criminal justice system.